Okay, so the third set of rules concern transparency, and the DSA is really packed with obligations concerning transparency. One of the main ones is the companies have to disclose how they aim to restrict the content. Because if they restrict the content without a basis in terms and conditions or in the law, that restriction will be arbitrary. They have an obligation to document the content moderation process and publish annual transparency reports. As you can see, that's the article highlighted in blue. There are extra obligations for the very large ones. They have to publish it more frequently, more extensively. Then the providers have an obligation to report on numbers. This applies to online platforms, so that we know if they are potentially very large. There's some obligations in how you design recommender systems and advertising, so that users understand the main parameters that these systems use or who the funders of advertising are. Again, we have extra obligations that apply to very large services such as advertising archives or the opt-out options from the recommender systems. They're not based on profiling. And then we have some special rules that apply only to the very large platforms, such as giving access to data in order to enable researchers to study the risks and potentially suggest how these risks can be better tackled on these services. And then also an obligation to publish those risk assessments that the companies make so that the public can study them and learn from them. One of the most important ones universally are content moderation reports obligation that you find in Article 15, which basically asks companies to publish aggregate numbers about how they implement orders, how they implement notifications, whether they do content moderation from their own initiative, how many complaints they're receiving, how many appeals they have, and what type of automated tools are they using. And this is quite extensive. There are templates, there are some new bylaws how to do this. But important thing to keep in mind is these reports only apply to mid-sized companies. So they do apply also to infrastructure services, mere conduits, caching, and hosting services, but they only apply if you're operated by a mid-sized company. One of the important obligations that I think is particularly has a potency to change many things is an obligation to disclose the specifications concerning the automated content moderation tools, not just naming the tools, but also describing them qualitatively, saying for what purposes you're using these tools, and reporting accuracy and error rates, and what safeguards are applied in case these tools are put to work on something that perhaps is not ideal for that specific tool. So there's certainly the idea that automated tools need to be better scrutinized. They sometimes need to be disclosed if decisions are based on them. And there's a hope that the DSA will generally contribute toward better testing and transparency of the accuracy and the quality of these tools across the ecosystem. Because if the company has to report this in the transparency report, they need to ask the vendor to do part of the testing. Now, data access is one additional obligation that applies only to very large online platforms. Very large online platforms have a particular obligation, special obligation to make data about the services available. So there's certain things like the advertising archives that need to be made public, where people can study why advertisers are coming to advertise, what they're advertising, how they're targeting their stuff. But then we also have these additional obligations where the researchers should be able to scrape the data from these services, use the APIs, and the providers are an obligation to provide the APIs so that researchers can study this. But also researchers are able to ad hoc apply for access even to non-public data. If they are vetted, they can basically study the risk with this non-public data. This is something that is then administered through the national digital service coordinators, but it's a little bit more, it's a slower process than using the publicly accessible data, which is certainly the starting point. In the future, probably there will also be clean rooms for regulators and researchers to access even more data than you can even on an ad hoc basis for different projects. So, Article 40, which is an important transparency rule for very large platforms, but it is equally important for researchers, basically has the three types of access. One is for regulators, but two are for researchers, and these are not just researchers in academia, but more broadly, and not just in Europe, but again more broadly, as long as they study risks in Europe, but that is rather flexible. And here researchers really have two routes. One is to the publicly accessible data, where the access is flexible. They can use scraping and APIs, and the other is the access through projects, where the projects need to go through the approval process at the local digital service coordinator. But then they unlock potentially even publicly inaccessible data. So with all of this, DSA creates many venues to get many insights about how these services operate, and that all is meant to feed into improved regulation of these services in the long run.